Hey guys, welcome back to
Yeah.
On1. I have a guest with me today who is a grazing ecologist and rancher currently based in Kenya. Nate, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you joining.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Glad to talk about the issues here.
Just before we started streaming, we were talking a little bit about where you're at in Africa, but I'm just so excited to hear more about you and how you ended up in Kenya, your background. So, can you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your experience as a grazing ecologist?
Right. Yeah. So I intersect with your world there, the world that we're specifically thinking about, that everybody's thinking about right now out in Point Reyes. But at the moment, I am in Kenya, and sort of the trajectory of my professional life since I was a high schooler or middle schooler has been in conserving grassland savanna ecosystems, and the way that I settled on doing that early on was to use livestock to do that. So I'm a rancher, but I came to it through ecosystem restoration and the native grasses of my native Wisconsin. I've worked a number of places in the process, gaining understanding of how to conserve floristic biodiversity. Plant biodiversity is kind of the thing that I've researched, or that we've got research. It's easier to study than some of the other things. We have a few ranches that I got started and worked for 6 or 8 years in the Bay Area in Sonoma and Marin County that we collected. We have now over a decade of plant biodiversity data from those ranches that sort of put things into perspective. My sort of philosophy is that I'm going to mimic the way herds of large grazing animals once moved over the landscape. Even in places where people don't think there was large grazing animals, there were, in my opinion. We've got tens of millions of years of grazing history in North America with animals that are very East Africa like. There's nowhere to find them anymore except in East Africa, and that's why I'm here now, is to
Okay.
learn better firsthand what those large animals do to shape the ecosystems, not just here, but everywhere else in the world, including on the California coast. So I use that approach in managing the ranches. I used it in California. We used it in California. I've got, a business partner, Byron Palmer, who is still operating all these ranches. Some of these ranches started as heavily grazed, you'd say heavily intensively utilized properties, ranches, and others were completely ungrazed. And those ungrazed ones, I would say, probably give us a picture of what the future is going to hold for ungrazed properties on Point Reyes National
Right.
Seashore.
And that's how we
And
connected initially was
right.
someone made me aware of your work that you really have for many years you've collected data to show what grazed property in a similar region to Point Reyes looks like compared to ungrazed. So I'm really excited to dive into that with you. But really quick, I was just curious as you were talking about your background. I love that it sounds like you didn't come from a ranching family per se.
I didn't. No, I didn't.
So your
My
love
dad is
of
an
grass kind of brought you to the ranching world. I mean, a lot of us, if you grew up in a ranching background, you are a grass farmer, whether you think about it that way or
right.
not. But we think about the animals. But
Uh-huh.
for you, it was grass first, and that led you to animal management. Is that right?
Yep. And I think, the animals, you grow to love the grass. And for me, yeah, starting with the grass, I grew to love the animal part of it too. And just stockmanship is just a big part of my life and all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's how I came to it. I came to it totally from a biodiversity perspective, and me sitting there thinking, like, how can I best do this biodiversity stuff that I love while, living in the
Yeah.
modern world.
Right.
And for real, I couldn't have known. When you're a kid, you think you know everything, but as it turns out, I really do think that the data shows that managing livestock well does increase plant biodiversity, can increase plant biodiversity. I'm not saying it inevitably does, but can increase native plant cover, which are the two data points that would love. I try to talk to anybody who's interested in it. I try to talk about the findings that we have because I don't know. I don't like people don't you don't hear it very often.
No,
You don't
you really
hear
don't.
this story, these trends. And so I guess I'll just tell those trends.
Yeah, please.
We what we did is we took 10 meter by 10 meter plots on these ranches. We took a lot of them. We have a lot, and we had a professional botanist, somebody other than me, come and every year at the right time of year, just count all the different plant species and categorize them native, non-native, that sort of thing, and take a few other ecological measurements. But the story that I think is really interesting is the biodiversity and the native plant cover element of that story. So I have a certain philosophy about how to graze stuff. We grazed it, and the heavily grazed, or maybe you'd say overgrazed, and the ungrazed properties all improved in plant biodiversity and in native cover about the same extent.
Wow.
So to me, I would say that abusing the land with cattle and taking the cattle off completely have about the same impact on the plant biodiversity.
And you were
So
grazing with cattle. You were using
I
cattle
was
to graze
grazing
these.
with cattle, and with
Okay.
really it was more cattle than the previous grazers, but it was just moving them a little differently. Over the course of about 6 years, we increased the number of species on those 10 by 10 meter plots by 101% on average. So
Wow.
if there was 15 plant species in that plot at the beginning, there was 30 at the end on average.
Wow.
So there's more species all the time, but the percentage of native cover also went up by
Mhm.
61%. So even as there was more species, a greater proportion of the ground was being covered by native species than by non-native species.
Can you kind of walk me through
Like the
like why it is that what's the
right,
relationship between grazing animals and native species specifically, not just non-native?
right, because like in hindsight, looking at it, I in California, it's such a low percentage, and those annual rangelands, and well, anywhere on the California coast, and if you're in a grassland community, it's just so few native species. Um, my take on it, I kind of feel like those biodiversity numbers and the native numbers go hand in hand, sort of. What I saw, because I was there and I could see it happening on the overgrazed places, there was a lot of palatable natives that the cattle would just keep coming back to. And on the ungrazed places, you would have a big, tall sward of grass
Mhm.
that was all one species. Whereas if you took it down, then you started to get more species, and almost
Got it.
maybe by chance, some of those are native, but the,
Hmm.
you none of the tallest species are going to be native on the California coast. You
Okay.
just you need it to be shorter in order to get more species. So
This unique to
um,
the California coast, these kind of results, or is it something that you've seen
I
in other areas too?
I seriously doubt that it's unique. And okay, so like tying into sort of a global perspective, right? You ask people, what is the most, well, let me ask you, the highest plant biodiversity in the world is
Hmm.
where?
Hmm. Would it be somewhere like where you are now in Kenya, where you have a lot of big grazers?
Well, I don't know. We haven't gotten the data for that yet. So I would think so. But okay, so you ask most people and they'll say like a rainforest, right? And,
Right. I'm a little biased.
and right. And so yeah, you're ahead of the curve here. So rainforests in Colombia and Ecuador and Panama have really high biodiversity, and they're the highest if you measure more than 10 acres. If you measure the number of plants in an area more than 10 acres. If you get smaller than that, so you get to the size of these plots that I'm taking, when you've got 1 acre plot or you've got a 10 meter by 10 meter plot, the highest plant biodiversity in the world is in Central and Eastern Europe, in
Wow.
managed pastures and managed hayfields that have been managed for maybe thousands of years. They draw a graph, and it's just there's no way of really saying that those managed pastures are less biodiverse than that rainforest in Panama, right? Or Ecuador.
That's so
And
interesting. Yeah.
so those places, they have probably a pretty similar rainfall to the California coast. They're managing those grasses so that they're not really tall, but they also want to get a continuous yield out of them. So
Mhm.
I also try to tell as many people about that information as possible because, kind of in the back of my head, I'm going for let's get the most biodiverse, let's break the record.
It's a good
Let's see.
mission.
The policy of taking cattle off of, it just had the potential to be because I worked on ranches on the point too.
Yeah. Oh,
When I was
okay.
before I started leasing my own places, I worked on places on the point, and it was such an opportunity for conservation and ranching to work together, you know,
Yeah.
because all the tools were right there, like in the Park Service. Otherwise, it's problematic to bring, domestic grazing animals in, which is what you need to do in order to mimic these processes sufficiently. But on the point, they're there, and now we've destroyed that opportunity. It's an unfortunate situation. I've picked out a few points. Since we have a video,
Yeah.
maybe
If you want to share your
I can show
screen
you.
for anyone watching this,
I'll
that would be
share the
great.
screen. On one of these ranches, it was managed for an NGO. The ecologist, he's a salamander expert. He said, "Okay, you're coming here. I have one rule that can't be broken. You must graze up to the edge of the water. You have to graze all around the pond. You can't leave grass around the edge. That is very important for tiger salamander. When you look at some of this data, taking the livestock off of the land just really doesn't have an ecological, I don't know,
Yeah,
basis.
absolutely. That's so funny, Nate, because I worked with this rancher who had a mitigation easement for tiger salamanders on his ranch in the Bay
Right,
Area. I did a story on him, and he talked to me about how, I can't remember which federal agency he was working with, but they came in and tried to institute some rules like fencing around this pond where there were tiger
right,
salamanders. And he made the point that the reason there were tiger salamanders was because of his management and his family's management for many generations. Why would they want to change what he was doing that had allowed them to flourish, that made the government want to put a mitigation easement on his property to begin with? And so they ended up backing off. But it's just funny how that's sort of the knee-jerk reaction that I see a lot, especially with these agencies. Take cattle off and it will improve this area that I'm already drawn to because of the biodiversity, because of the way that this has been managed and the results.
yeah, and like I say, he was the expert. He did the research, and he could manage it any way he wanted, and he knew that they just can't move around in the thick grass on the edge of the red-legged frogs. This was for red-legged frogs and tiger salamanders, and the tiger salamanders. He said after we were managing for a while, he said, "I'm starting to see tiger salamanders in the creeks. We never saw them in the creeks. Nobody ever sees them in the creeks.
Uh,
And how is this possible?" And I don't know how it's possible, but we definitely changed. Anybody who starts grazing someplace well starts to very dramatically change the hydrology of a place so that the stream runs more during the dry time, you know?
Yeah.
And so, Point Reyes is a pretty unique little microclimate on the California coast in that it's surrounded on both sides by water. And so it's got a very wet climate. And so it's got a lot of perennial grass. And now it's almost all non-native perennial grass. And so I picked a few plots that we took that have a similar sort of look to it here as what you'd find out on the point. Phalaris aquatica, that's harding grass, and Holcus lanatus, that's velvet grass. Ecologists out there hate these grasses. They're non-native, they're invasive, they take over. You can see right
Yeah.
now on the original first year, harding grass is 40% and velvet grass is 25%. And there
Okay.
is 4 forbs and 0 native grasses, right? And so
And this is in
then
2013. And did you put in a grazing program at some point in here, I'm assuming?
this is the original, yeah, this is the baseline. So
Okay.
the grazing started in 2014, right?
Okay.
And so
Wow.
as as time goes on, you can see the percentage go down. In 2024, the last one, the harding grass is at 20%, but that's quite a bit less. Velvet grass is at 1%. And then look at how many other different species of grass
Wow.
there are. The forbs, look at how many different species. 11, where there was only 3 or 4. There's another forb. And then there's some native grass even
Wow.
coming
That's
in.
amazing.
Native
I
grass
hope people
started.
watch this on the video because this is really cool. It's a steep decline in those invasive
Yeah.
non-native grasses and a lot more diversity. So for people who are laymen who don't think about grass, they don't have cattle, this is all really new to them. And again, that knee-jerk reaction right now is grazing is bad, rewilding is better. What would you say are kind of the top line reasons why grazing has this kind of effect and why it's beneficial for an environment?
Because it's got tens of millions of years of evolutionary history behind it. The time that there has not been huge East Africa style megafauna in Western North America is, I'd say it, these grasses, many of them are 40 million years old. 95+% have been in the fossil record for 10 million years at the generic level, right? So if it's 40 million years old, these grassland ecosystems, they have been without these large grazing animals just since humans arrived. Humans, in my opinion, and in the opinion of, I think, most of the people who study this, humans caused the extinctions of these animals. And so the past 11,000 years has been the only time that these vegetation communities have not had large grazing animals. For 99.9996% of the evolution of these plants, they were exposed to herbivory at a level that only I barely know here in Africa. There was elephants and ground sloths and camels and horses and bison, to a degree that we don't understand and we have a hard time seeing. And the majority of the species don't do well under different conditions. So you lose most of them. That's the driver of the diversity, is bringing those impacts back onto the land. That's the 10,000-foot view. Like I say, the grass being short, but not too short. 3 times taller than your neighbor that grazes, but a third as tall as your neighbor that doesn't graze. So that light can penetrate to get most of the plants, but all the plants still have room to express themselves. That's really, one of the things that I always look for is some of the grass always is able to get away and be tall, and some of the grass is quite short, and there's something in between. When you have that sort of heterogeneity of heights, then you're just going to have more species than if it's all one thing, which is what you get when you say, well, we're closing down your ranches and there's not going to be anything grazing. It's all one thing, and it's all going to turn into the harding grass and fescue and velvet grass.
Yeah.
And
I
yeah,
hear ranchers and biologists talking about the mosaic pattern that grazing creates that's really good for little animals like you're talking about, salamanders, red-legged frogs, also ground nesting birds. It gives them a place to hide from predators and to build their nests. And so they have a symbiotic relationship with these large grazers like you're describing.
yeah, exactly. The birds are a big part of it when you realize that a lot of birds just cannot forage in that thick, tall grass, which sounds crazy. But when you look at these birds, there's a lot more rare birds now that need short grass conditions than there are birds that are rare because they need tall grass conditions. You
Yeah,
know, it's part of the ecosystem that's missing.
right.
I have another plot that shows a really similar pattern. This is the Holcus lanatus, velvet grass, and fescue. So between those two in our first plot in 2013, it's 75% of the ground is covered by that. There's three forbs, and then at the end, the Holcus lanatus,
Wow.
the velvet grass, is down to 1%, and the fescue is down to 3%. And there's 3% harding grass, and then there's 10 species of grass there, something like that, whereas there was four before. And then look at all those forbs that are
Wow.
there. 15. And there's some native grass. Look at all that native grass that's there now all of a
Wow.
sudden.
That's
15%
amazing.
native grass.
So grazers
And,
basically give these other species a chance. They're not allowing one really dominant invasive species to choke out all the diversity that you want that you
exactly.
want to see there. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, that graph is really that's 10 years and that change is so dramatic.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like it's dramatic when it's happening, right? Like every
Right,
year,
right. Watching grass grow.
it's
That's
watching
amazing.
grass grow. And but you get this like there's a feeling that you get when things are moving in the right direction, and you just you want to see it happen, and you want to make sure that you don't mess anything up and all that kind of stuff. And so
Yeah.
um
And the
it's
cattle also
yeah,
put something back into the grass, obviously. They're not just depleting, their manure is actually replenishing. Can you talk about that a
yeah.
little bit? That's my layman's understanding.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, these grasslands, my way of looking at it is they relied on grazing animals to do a lot of things for them. The grasses long ago lost the ability to drop their leaves. A tree, you think of a deciduous tree, drops its leaves all the time. Grasses became so dependent on grazing animals that they've lost their ability to drop their leaves. If they don't have something come and take that material away, then they are underneath the canopy of the old material. Like that is sunlight that's bouncing back into space and will never again create life. It'll travel into a cold, dark universe forever, and it'll never create life again. They need animals to cycle the nutrients. They need animals to take away their dead leaves. They need animals to plant their seeds for them. And the seeds need to get planted by the hooves. The seeds cannot germinate in over here where it's
Right.
40% velvet grass and 35% fescue. They can't, they just can't,
So
they never were
their
adapted
hooves
to do
kind
that.
of aerate the soil as well.
Yeah, there needs to be a bare ground for at some point a seed bed that can receive those seeds. And that's
Right.
another thing that the animals do is just by pushing that old material, that old thatch into the ground, which is another thing that we measure, the thatch levels. And by pushing that into the ground, cycling those nutrients, putting manure onto it, then all of a sudden, well, it's like think of if you were going to hydro seed your lawn,
Yeah.
what would you do? You know, you'd rake it up,
Yep.
you'd throw some seed on top of it, you'd throw some straw on top of it, you'd water it, and you'd stand back, and it would grow grass like crazy. But if you just go to your lawn right now and you want to change it to a different grass and you just throw seed in there, you might as well just throw the money out there. It doesn't, it's not going to do
Right.
anything. And so, yeah, they need, for like pretty much the most basic functions of a plant, they rely on those herbivores to provide those functions.
One of the arguments you'll hear is that there's some difference between domesticated cattle, goats and sheep, specifically cattle for this discussion, and the, ruminants that used to be present in these landscapes like bison. What would you say to that?
Yeah, that's crazy. I yeah. That's crazy. Like I say, I am in this to do stuff for the plants, right? And the domestic animals will help you create natural conditions better than the wild animals on the vast majority of landscapes because you can manage them. You can put them where they need to be to mimic the way that animals used to move when there was no fences and there was predators and there was all these sort of things. You just can't chuck, like, oh, well, the elk are going to do it on Point Reyes. That's crazy. That's just absolutely out of touch with reality. Elk are reliant as grazers. They are just as reliant on larger grazing animals as the plants are. They cannot deal with this velvet grass that's 3 foot high. They can't eat that. It's, to me, it is inhumane to stick the elk out onto a field of tall velvet grass and say, okay, there you go. Now you figure it out. That's not how elk were ever meant to graze. They follow behind larger animals. And, historically it was elephants, horses, bison. I have one of the videos I made was just how, from my read on things, horses are more native than bison, because horses have been in North America for 50 million years. Every plant in North America has been shaped by horses. The bison are great. Bison belong in North America, but they've been in North America for 100 or 200,000 years. So how a bison is going to have some geometry of its jaw or physiology that's going to meaningfully be different enough that the plants need that, I think is just, it's sort of metaphysical, right? It's like mystical to me.
Totally.
So again, just to show the pattern, and it's like, this is the pattern, even if the species aren't the same, all of our plots showed this sort of pattern that you see, where if you can't see it on the screen, if you're just listening to this, in this instance, the non-native grass takes up 80% of the plot, which is pretty normal, and then slopes down, and over a decade still takes up 50%. But now there's a lot more species. Like, look at that. You've got, in the first baseline year, you've got 5 forb species. And then in the most recent year, you've got 20 forb species.
It's amazing.
And so and like, what does that do for pollinators, right? What does that do for
It's a ripple effect. Soil and water retention and all of these things. That we have a drought-prone climates in large parts of Northern California and the American West. These grazers absolutely help with that too, is correct?
I really think so. Again, I have another video where, like, in some places, even in the grazing community, people talk about, you've got to let the grass grow really tall, before it's grazed. Well, to me, that you lose a lot of the biodiversity benefits if you don't have that matrix. You have some grass that's really tall, but it's not a very high percentage, and you've got other grass at different level. That really tall grass, you look at a hydrological table, it sucks out moisture from the ground 4 times faster than a nice, I'm putting my hands up, something that's 6 or 8 or 10 inches high. You lose all that water. Whereas if you've got a short sward that you're taking good care of, it's going to just conserve that water a lot better.
Right. And do you have any data on carbon sequestration at all that you've looked at?
We don't have very good data on carbon sequestration, unfortunately. Other people in California do. I'd love to try to go back and take better carbon data. That's,
Intuitively, it makes sense, right? With everything you're describing and the process of photosynthesis that we learn about pretty young, it would make
yeah.
sense that growing more
Yeah.
plants, this type of biodiversity you're showing here, where there aren't one dominant plant that is allowed to dominate a rangeland, it would make sense that photosynthesis, you're sequestering more carbon when you are allowing more plant growth.
There was a paper out in 2024 that did the rounds that really, again, too, even in the ranching circles, there's some people that claim, well, if you let the grass grow really tall, you're going to sequester more carbon. It really poured cold water on that because, from what they said, the microbes like to eat the same kind of grass that the cattle do. They,
Hmm.
whether it's below ground, the grass below ground or above ground, and it's by stimulating those microbes that you get the carbon that's permanent. You think you see a tall woody stem of grass that's going to be long lasting, but it's not particularly. It decays very quickly and goes back into the atmosphere. But when the grass is shooting sugars to those microbes in the little tiny nooks and crannies of the soil, that's where the carbon lasts for a long time. And it does that when there's regular grazing. That was a interesting paper. I could send you that
Yeah, I
if you
would love
need
to
to
see
link.
that. That's really interesting. I'll definitely share that. So I have
Yeah.
to ask
Um,
if you've done all this, I mean, this is really amazing that you've done all of these studies very close to a large conserved national seashore with agriculture on it. Has the Park Service reached
uh,
out to you to talk about any of this? If you've made it publicly available, you have a group that's published all of these findings. Have you heard from the government?
no, no way. Not surprised. I mean, like even when this data, even in 2013, when I was even before I started collecting that data, I think everybody knew that the Park Service was not interested in hearing data. I mean, they falsified records about the oyster farm.
Right.
They said, "Oh, we're closing down the oyster farm because of impacts on marine mammals," and like they wouldn't release the data, and they wouldn't release the data, and finally they released the data, and it showed no impacts on marine mammals.
Right. For people that don't know about
So
that, that was Drake's Bay Oyster Farm on Point Reyes, which I think at one point produced half the oysters in California. It was a sustainable family business out there in Point Reyes, which was shut down in 2012, 2014, something like that. So the science behind it, justifying them terminating the lease, was junk science.
yeah, well, the science was good. They just didn't listen to it. I mean,
They
like
actually falsified it.
once they released the data, it showed that there was no the kayakers and that sort of thing had created more problems or as many problems as the oyster. Like there was like one incidence of seals moving because of the boats, the boats coming out. So yeah, I think because it never would have even occurred to me that the Park Service would have been interested in this data. So
Why do you
yeah.
think that is? I mean, I'm asking you to speculate, I guess, but what's your opinion?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just some bigger directive on high that I don't understand. That's not based on like biodiversity, nature, like as a nature geek like myself. It's not based on the sort of things that I base management off of. So I have no clue. I think the idea of making designated wilderness an hour from San Francisco, yeah, beyond that, I don't. I don't have any information on that. I don't have a study that can provide us with hard facts on that one.
Right. Right. What do you expect to happen out on Point Reyes once the cattle are gone, say in 10 years? What will that area look like, in your opinion?
I think I think we have every reason to believe it'll be, like go back to the data that I had and run it in reverse.
Yeah.
That graph is going to run in reverse, and eventually it'll be velvet grass and coyote bush. I think that is not a very high conservation priority, and it's such a wasted, it's like the opportunity cost of what that land could be. And, another thing that I like to talk about is just what land does to the human spirit. I saw a post kind of similar that speaks to this that you did. Like, we are savanna hunter gatherers deep down, right? We evolved in this land that I'm at. We evolved the ability to tell when land was good, and we call it beauty, right? And because when the grass got really tall, that meant there weren't any grazing animals around to hunt, right? And when you see the thick brush start to move all over everything, there was no browsing animals to eat it. You're going to take a place that had the potential to really like nourish in sort of a deep way millions of people, and you're going to turn it into something that says like ew, like keep moving. Because the peace that we feel when we look at a nice green pasture with scattered trees on it, like that is millions of years old. That's evolutionarily induced, in my opinion. That comes from something much higher than us. And when you see a thicket of dark brush and tall grass, you get the feeling like, let's keep moving. And to me, national parks are to nourish the human spirit and to conserve biodiversity. And this, broke multi-generational families and moved us farther away from the park's directives and mission.
It's really well said. Yeah, I mean, my personal belief is I do believe we were designed, but whether you believe we were designed by God or shaped by nature, it's really the same effect, right? You still have there's something innate, there's something deeper than us that reacts to these environments and that was clearly meant to thrive in this way. And all of nature responds to it in a very holistic way that we can't even understand. We barely have the science to catch up to what we know on a deeper level. Some of
Right.
the
I
studies that you've shared are just data to, again, define and describe and prove what our ancestors knew and what we've always known and what you're even, what you're describing and how we react to landscapes.
Exactly. That's my opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, however, whatever the mechanism, we have something inside of us that is connected to land and that lights up in a certain way and when it is a certain way. And
Right.
you have to have, in this world, in this fallen world, like you have to have people that can help you make it that way. And
Right.
the Park Service pick those people out.
Uh, yeah, it seems like a real loss and a real tragedy. And again, I think it's so powerful that you have these studies available. I don't understand how no one's asked you for them or referenced them, but I'm so thankful that you shared them here. So at least we know about them. And I think, there's something too that is we haven't really discussed in all the coverage about Point Reyes, but it's very demeaning to these people who have built their lives on this property and who have generations of stewardship here to suggest and to accuse them of destroying a beautiful place. That's what they're doing. They're saying that you are bad for this land and you have to go because you are a problem. And for most of these folks, and you can probably attest more than me, I'm going off of the ranchers who I knew and grew up with, but you know a lot of the folks that are directly impacted by this. They're not wealthy people. They're not, this isn't something that you do for money. This is a choice because it's a lifestyle choice and you love it and you want to raise your kids that way and you truly care about the land because again, you're a grass farmer. So if you hurt your grass, you don't have a future. So there's just, I think what you've done is again, give credence to and dignity back to these people who have been really demeaned in a way that I think is very inhumane.
Yeah. I agree with that. It became a antagonistic thing that it was sort of an inhuman process of we are going to make this into something that's going to, be numbers on a piece of paper somewhere far away. And in the process, we're going to steamroll, these people. And like I say, the potential, because that is something that in conservation people don't talk enough about is like when a conservation entity, whether it's a government or a NGO, takes over, if they don't do a good job, if they don't achieve their biodiversity outcomes, what happens? Where is the accountability on that? Like the land turns over and then it's done. Everybody forgets about it, And so no, we're not checking to see if this is the right management. And so on the private side, if people mess up and don't do good management, they can lose it and somebody else can do it. But we really lock ourselves in to a very specific kind of management that I don't think we have evidence to suggest is the best if this is the way that we do conservation. It's a little bit tricky. And, like I've got to say, I've also worked with another of the I've had several chapters in my life, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, where, there's still the same problems, but the people that I work with have really put themselves out there to help make sure that there is management on the land and that there are people on the land and that sort of thing. And so far, that's the problem. Again, government is forever. We've got to see how it all works, but it would have been an opportunity on Point Reyes to do it a different way, to do it a real innovative way. But there are other agencies and other places that are taking up the mantle now, and so we'll see how they do on that
Yeah.
front.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, man, I have so many more questions I could ask you. This has been really interesting. I'm really grateful for your time. I know it's getting late in Kenya. I didn't even really I wanted to hear more about Africa and what you've learned there and what you're doing there. So maybe we'll have to do this again. Is there anything else you can add or that I should be asking you? Anything you want to mention before we go?
Oh, that's good. I've rambled on a lot, so I didn't wait to be asked. So I think it's good. But anytime you want to follow up on everything else that's going on, yeah, let's do it again. It's fun.
Yeah, I would love that. This is really, really fascinating. Well, Nate, where can people find you, read your work, see what you're doing?
Yeah, Instagram at Project Savanna and projectsavanna.com. Facebook also, I guess. If you're in a little really geeky grazing group or extinct animal group, then you'll probably know who I am. Otherwise, yeah, those are good places. Projectsavanna.com, Project
Yeah,
Savanna on the socials.
Project Savanna. Okay, I've been reading your blog. There's a lot of good stuff on there people should go check out. Thank you so much, Nate. Really appreciate you and your time.
Thank you too for getting the word out. Really appreciate your efforts on all these fronts, but especially personally for the Point Reyes stuff.
Thank you. We'll see what we can do for them.